Rightfully so. There's a lot of distrust and dislike for a lot of governments at the moment.
Yeah.
Rightfully so.
Yeah.
There are also a lot of Bitcoiners who believe in things like the sovereign individual thesis or the end of the state. We have many people listen to the show, libertarians, anarcho-capitalists. I am not. I'm reluctantly pro-democracy, and I am somebody who wishes the state was smaller, but I believe no state would be a net worse decision. And I also believe the state is a natural conclusion. If you get rid of it, you end up rebuilding it. But I think it's a useful topic to talk through because it really pisses people off that I or others don't hold the same position. And I think you should always be honest with what you think and why you think. But I thought you would be a good person to work it through because the desire for absolute liberty is I understand the moral position, but I think it comes with risks and potentially is net worse.
I don't understand the moral position of absolute freedom. And the reason is because when I hear people talk about it, it's very obvious to me that absolutely everybody knows that there are limits to freedom. So absolute freedom is not something that anybody believes in. It's kind of like free markets. You know, the free markets always say that like the moment that you require people wear pants to come and trade, you no longer have a free market. And because there's a rule. And that's just the way, like, I think you're right. I think that like government is the natural end of most anarchic systems. You just end up with like a different form or maybe a similar form. I don't know. Like, what does Churchill say? This democracy is a terrible system except for all the rest or something.
It's the
like
worst form of government apart from all the others. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably correct. Although like the state does suck right now. There's a lot of problems. I've done this for years, like when we were doing Bitcoin Uncensored, we talked a lot about like externalities. And one of the things we would say that was provocative was that freedom is an externality. Because like, you don't know, like you have absolute freedom. It's great until your neighbor comes and like shits on your lawn, you know? And if you have a bunch of people together, like how do you deal with that? And libertarians will cite the NAP principle or whatever. And that breaks down pretty quickly as soon as you have a person who's willing to do violence to you very quickly before you can respond or, you know, murder you. So I've always found arguments for freedom to be very interesting, particularly in Bitcoin. And when I came here, I actually would have called myself an anarchist. I was very strongly in support of the deconstruction of the state. And what changed my mind was watching prominent Bitcoiners at conferences and having them come up to me and tell me that they like, I went to a conference called Coins in the Kingdom, and there was an obvious Ponzi scheme sitting in the middle of the floor. And they were advertising their services and going like, basically advertising, we are a Ponzi scheme. Come and give us your money. And I was like, oh, okay, well, they're a Ponzi scheme. So I went and sat in the middle of the floor for the rest of the conference. And just as people came up to the table, I'd be like, this is very obviously a Ponzi scheme. This is a Ponzi scheme. You know, at the end of the weekend, one of the libertarian, like a really prominent libertarian who many libertarians have heard of, came up to me and goes, thank you so much. I was going to send in a bunch of money to that group. Thanks for informing me. And I realized that day that like these people who are adults who have their money, who are screaming about the fact that they want the government to not like tell them what to do, they're so irresponsible that they can't identify like very obvious schemes in the space, and they give their money to them all the time. And that's been true of most of us. I think like if you've been in Bitcoin, if you were in Bitcoin early, or if you've been in long enough, it's hard not to come up with like a person who hasn't given their money somehow to a scam.
But isn't that what the free market does? It weeds out the scams from the legitimate projects because you have a free market to decide what is and isn't a scam, and ultimately they get defunded.
Ultimately, but then a lot of people lose their money. And in a society, it's very hard because if you have a lot of people losing their money, things happen because they get older. They don't have money for retirement. They can't pay their medical bills. Like, you know, there's all sorts of things that are problematic in a society where we like all kind of like take on some of the burden together to live with one another. So, yeah, I mean, like it's, to me, the idea of ultimate freedom has never made any sense. The libertarian ethos in general has always been something that I've really been bothered by because everything is sort of this absolutist statement. Like we are, inflation is bad, right? Something like that. Like inflation is bad. Well, inflation is just like a decrease in your spending power, right? And Bitcoin causes that all the time. Like Bitcoin's dropped 50% sometimes, and that is a decrease in your spending power. So I always, when we were doing BU, I would like point out like, oh, Bitcoin inflated 50% or like 100% yesterday. It would really piss them off.
Well, I think it's a fair point, but I think these things are worth working through, and the reason being is that I am somebody who reluctantly supports the idea of democracy.
Yeah,
because I look around the world and I see everything else.
You're a government simp.
Well, I mean, and I actually prefer the U.S. form, and it's not democracy; it's a republic. I understand that, but
it's
like
not democracy, it's a republic, Peter.
Yeah, I know. But in my mind, democracy means the ability to vote. Okay, let's just establish that, and you have the ability to vote here within a republic,
right?
And it's obviously in many ways a better system than we have in the UK. But at the same time, I'm not one of these burn it down people. But I had a discussion on Twitter recently. It came up where somebody was challenging my thoughts on this, and they said, "Well, let's start with first principles. Is coercion bad?" And I'll ignore the discussion I had about first principles with the person, but it's very hard to come back and say, is coercion bad? No, it isn't. Coercion's okay. I mean, nobody wants to be coerced, but I think it simplifies something that is complex, and I don't think you can make a decision on how 330 million people here, 70 million in the UK, how they can organize and govern themselves based on this one first principle. Because it puts you in a place where you can't deal with the nuance.
Well, I would say it's not even right. Like coercion's good sometimes.
Okay.
Like, I don't know, you're in a house, the house is on fire, and like someone comes up and coerces you to go out. Like coercion is not bad simply because it's coercion. This is fundamentally the problem with a lot of this sort of, what do they call it? Praxeology, which sounds like a doctor who looks at your butt. As a proctology, praxeology. Like this is the problem with it, because there's this idea that you go back to first principles and you ask these questions that seem like they have very simple answers, but they don't. Like coercion, when your insurance company tries to go get you to like do once of your checkups, they offer incentives. That's coercive. It's good for you. Like coercion is not bad simply because it's coercion. And while you may have this sort of visceral reaction to it, it's not necessarily bad. So the answer to is coercion bad? The answer is not necessarily. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's not. And that's again, like this notion, like the libertarian belief is that you like divide things into two categories. You have like good and you have the bad side. And they have this list of words they put on the bad side, and they ask you questions, and like oftentimes it's stuff that you've never really considered, right? You've never really thought about whether coercion is bad, and then they say it to you, and all of a sudden, like you're kind of forced into this corner. Like, well, it actually does. I hate being coerced. I don't like coercion by the state generally. Like coercion, I guess coercion's bad, yeah. And you don't think about the fact that like there's a lot of times when coercion is just fine, and you as a parent probably coerce your kids to do things. Like it's not bad because it's bad. There's not things that are bad and things that are good. Inflation sometimes probably fine.
They coerce me to do things as well, my kids.
Yeah. Well, that's what kids learn coercion early. I mean, that's the thing. Like, even as a kid, like, kids coerce teachers into giving them better grades so they can get into better colleges. Like, these are all things, like, coercion is not bad simply because it's coercion, And that's, like, I don't understand this whole idea of living in a world where your philosophy is based on, like, good things and bad things. Because to me, like, there's a lot of nuance. There is not a good thing and a bad thing. Sometimes things most things are neutral at the very least. And we have a word, maybe coercion is bad because like the sort of connotation of the word is bad. But I can think of many times, maybe even a majority of the coercion that we experience on a day-to-day basis is not bad.
It's just coercion based on how society functions.
What is an advertisement? Like they're coercive in some ways.
I'd find that one more of a stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I'm just saying, like, you're coerced regularly, and I don't know why it would just be like bad because it's called coercion. It doesn't make sense to me.
I think it comes from that point of no one has like rule over me. No one can tell me what to do. I was born free, therefore I should be free.
Yeah, you're born naked. Then your parents put clothes on you. I mean, the state of nature arguments as well are always like very interesting to me because, you know, we're born in. I mean, this I talked to libertarians about this in Bitcoin for many years, and this idea that like you arrived here, and it's sort of this like I see this with millennials in particular. They love to they see the world in this way, but there's this idea that I arrived here and the world as I arrived is like somehow like a state of nature that I should start from, right? So I have a house, I have land, I live in the middle of South Dakota, and this is great. I have 10 acres, it's beautiful, and the government can't tell me what to do. And then like you go back, you're like, yeah, but like, you know, 4, 5, 6 generations ago, the government ran a bunch of Indians off your land. They killed a bunch of people, and then the army said that we're going to defend your land, and they put them on a little reservation, and now you have it. And like, to me, it's very interesting that this sort of like disacknowledgement of like what happened to get the thing that you have. And I'm like not a fan of like sort of this modern like intersectional history stuff that everybody's doing, but there is a historical precedent for like what we have today. Like libertarians living on like, you know, 10 acres of land or something like that, and like raising cows and refusing to get like environmental studies done and such. Like it's very interesting to me that they like issue this sort of government when the government is the thing that kept and protected their land in the first place for many, many years, many generations. And there's no acknowledgement of it.
Well, there is also that chronological benefit of property rights.
Yes.
When people we'll get into property rights.
We have strong property rights in the West.
Yeah.
Like it's again like very interesting. I mean, this is you see this in Bitcoin all the time. Like countries that don't have strong property rights, people look at and they're like, oh, blockchains will solve that, right? Like Honduras with Factum, they said that we were going to put all the land records on blockchains. Somehow that magically like creates property rights. There's this belief that like somehow if it's on a blockchain, you have property rights. Right. I don't know, put it in Ethiopia or something like that. The belief is that if a child soldier comes around or like an adult soldier comes around and says, this is my land now. Well, you know, like you have this thing that you can appeal to like, well, the blockchain says it's actually mine. It's like, well, I'll shoot you, you know, and he'll take your land. And that's the same thing. Like in the West, we have very strong property rights structures that have been developed over like hundreds of years. And it's wonderful. It's really wonderful for us to like live in. But at the same time, like this idea that the government wasn't part of that, like to me, it's unfathomable to have strong property rights without strong government.
Well, that's a conversation we had yesterday. If the basis is property rights, who's going to protect your property rights?
Right.
Your gun.
Well, me, I'm gonna hire a mercenary army.
But you can game it through. Okay, so you've got 10 acres of land. I turn up with my militia. I kick you off it. How do you enforce your property rights if there's no government?
Yeah, I agree.
But there are answers to that. What I'm saying is libertarians have answers to that. They say there will be independent arbitrators, but who gives them authority?
Correct. Courts. I mean, like, again, but every time you have that discussion, like you end up backing into an entire system of government, which is like very, very dumb. Like the fact that you're trying to like get rid of government and substitute it with, you know, some other form that looks a lot like government. And that always happens, like, because you have to come back somewhere. And so you're going to have this like whole system of like independent, like arbitration, independent courts, independent, like, you know, whatever it is that they say. And at the other end, you just end up with government. Well, all the services of government.
But even in that thing, this is where I see some of the things that are broken have not really been thought through correctly. So even if you have an independent court, and you take me to an independent court to say that property is yours, but I take you to another independent court.
And they choose differently.
They choose differently. Who has the overall authority on that? And I've still never heard a good answer to that.
The answer is the person with the bigger mercenary army.
But potentially. And who says without risk of imprisonment, who isn't going to be vulnerable to different incentives? If I'm very rich and I wanted your land and I go to that independent court and I know who the judge is, what's to stop me leveraging that position? And I know you can do that in the current system now, but there is that monopoly of power which becomes a risk.
The monopoly of power, which is coercion.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, who enforces a lot of that stuff? Like, we have sheriffs, we have, you know, elected bodies and stuff like that. Like, I think the problem of freedom is that there's this notion that it can be unbridled, and like you can the state, like we were talking about the state of nature arguments, like this idea that like you're born naked into the world, you go out naked, and you can be naked in between all of that time, and that's totally okay. And just this idea that like you can kind of do anything you want, but nobody wants to acknowledge like the role of government. And my belief is that the role of government is a very strong, the place where it's strongest is in its management of externalities. And like, if you acknowledge that freedom is one of those externalities, you have to acknowledge that there are like limits to that sort of state of nature argument. And that's the same thing with like, you know, you have land upstream of somebody else's land. Can you let your cows poop in it? Can you build a dam? Can you do whatever, destroy like what's going on downstream, kill the trout? I mean, all of these are things that like are very difficult to answer because like property rights you'd think would supersede, like they're on my land, I can do whatever I want. But like these things affect things downstream. They affect your neighbor. I mean, the fire department, if your house is burning and it's putting your neighbor's house at risk, and you know, in the libertarian world, you're paying for insurance, right? Or you're paying for the fire department stuff. So like if you're paying a fire department to put out the fire, do they come and put out both fires? You know, like if your house is burning, it's putting your neighbors at risk, and let's say you don't pay, right? So like they'll just let it burn until it hits the house that burns. Like it's absolute insanity. Like when you take these things to their logical extent, and I hear them argued all the time to their logical extent, which, you know, blows my mind.